Welcome to Season 3 of Talk ADHD, Conversations Worth Having. This podcast is here to help you make sense of ADHD, using a combination of interviews with the leading voices in the field of ADHD, as well as commentary from Andrew and I on the topics that are being discussed around ADHD. We hope this podcast and its evidence-based approach is what you need to really make sense of ADHD for you. Andrew is an ADHD clinician and a neurodevelopmental expert, and I am a neurodivergent author, educator, mentor, and consultant. It's our passion to make sure that everything we do and everyone we speak to talks from an evidence-based approach. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Talk ADHD. In this week's episode, Andrew and I are discussing the recently published ADHD Task Force interim report. We're hopefully going to help you make sense of a few very important things. Who was the report for? What's the purpose of a task force like this? And how can you make sense of some of the things you may have read in the report? It's really important that this context is shared so that people understand what it is the task force is there for, who their information is to help, and how you can communicate what it means to you to other people. So, we really hope this episode helps you make sense of this interim report and helps you prepare for the final report due at the end of the summer. We are actually back, Andrew. This is episode 1 of season 3. There's a lot of conversation about ADHD at the moment, particularly with the release yesterday of the ADHD Task Force's interim report, so their preliminary findings. It feels more important than ever to share some thoughts on that, share some clarity around that, because I think it could easily be misconstrued. Before we go into the detail of what the report has said, do you just want to give a very brief overview of why was a task force set up, what the aims were from your point of view, and as a clinician, what you were expecting or still expect from a task force?
Okay, so I think there's been a lot of hope and expectation around the task force, and people have brought their own agendas to it. And the government commissioned task force for lots of things, although this one is specifically around ADHD, which is wonderful. And I would imagine that lots of people in the ADHD community are feeling potentially a little deflated by what it says, feeling like things have been missed or they've been let down. But that's not the way I'm reading it. I think when you read this document, it's important to remember it's not targeted at those of us with ADHD. It's not targeted at those of us working in the field of ADHD. It's a government commissioned report. It's a politician sitting in his office saying, tell me what I need to know. Give me a briefing document about ADHD. What's going on and what can we do about it? And I think if you read it with that approach, you see a very different document than potentially a document that could leave people feeling, well, what are you going to do about the waiting lists? What are you going to do about all of the problems that we're all so aware of because we live with them day in, day out? I, for one, from the inception of the task force, was quite clear. It was never going to solve the waiting list problem. That can't be a goal of the task force. I think they've addressed the fact that there are limited resources, that there are more people needing support as it is defined now. I think this report shines a light on some bigger problems that those more focused in on the world of ADHD may have overlooked. And I think that's the advantage of it being led by a public health specialist rather than an ADHD specialist.
So let's just really define this difference between the report seems to me at least, and talking to you, it seems to be really trying to help people understand that the goal is to bring ADHD out of a social media conversation, out of a clickbait articles conversation, out of the scaremongering, and to change that conversation into one about public health, one that acknowledges the scale of the situation, the amount of people of all ages who are seeking assessment, receiving diagnosis, or even think that they may. So what do you think the benefit of that approach is? Why does that seem to be a theme running through this interim report?
Okay, so it's about the social culture and that wider society's perception of what ADHD is and what responsibility we as a wider society, everybody living in the country, has to that, just as any other social issue. I think this document really flies the flag for, hey, this isn't going away, this isn't just a flash in the pan fad that is the latest trendy thing. As we well know, it's not. It's a milestone in what ADHD is. That stigma, it is about a level of ignorance, and this document starts the journey towards social acceptance and sets out some of the potential directions that can be taken. And this is a big piece of work. This isn't, as the document says, it's not the remit of health alone. ADHD is not a health condition. And then you get into the debate about what psychiatry is, and but if you look at other conditions treated by psychiatry, not all services for people with mental health problems are delivered by the NHS or health services. There are social care services, there are accommodations in education, and it should be the same for ADHD.
Yeah.
And I think beyond that, I think we can go beyond that another step further, which is a step you've certainly taken in the past year in your work in workplace education, and that seeing difficulties focusing, keeping concentration needn't necessarily be sort of, oh, that's ADHD. That's a thing in itself that people experience, and it is at the extreme of that. But there are people without ADHD who struggle to concentrate, and as a society, can we help one another to construct society differently, just like in the 90s when we dropped the curbs and all of a sudden you didn't have to bounce down a curb when you were in a wheelchair, or those little bobbly paving slabs for the partially sighted. This is something that happens in society, and I see this task force report as an opportunity to see that level of change, that sort of deeply entrenched in society type of change that dropping curbs or textured paving slabs brought.
Yeah, and actually it was interesting that the language the report has used, it's been shaped and guided by what they've termed the experts by experience rather than the clinical experts. So they talk about looking at ADHD and neurodivergence broadly in the same remit. The fact that we do need to start recognizing that not everyone who struggles with attention or focus or impulsivity would meet the current diagnostic criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD. But that does not mean they're not struggling, nor does it mean that there aren't coexisting conditions that could be exacerbating those things. This isn't just seeing ADHD in isolation. It's seeing ADHD, a very public, pervasive conversation, one that's getting a lot of attention. I think what this interim report has done for me is it helps people that don't understand start to maybe see it as not a thing on its own. It's this thing of, we know ADHD coexists with a lot of other conditions. And so this umbrella term of neurodivergence, I think inherently that's a good thing. It also comes back to this concept of not seeing public health and healthcare in individual silos, and not seeing other public departments or government departments in silo either. So there's mentions of the fact that healthcare has to communicate with criminal justice, with education, workplace, hence all of the different subgroups. It goes away from a clickbait buzzword conversation to this isn't going away, right? We are not suddenly going to clear a waiting list and no one else will ever want an assessment or diagnosis. That's not what that's about. It actually helps other people realize that it's important and we have to think about it differently. So the positives for me are, if that helps the conversation continue with more people who understand less than those of us who are particularly invested in ADHD, then that is a good thing. And yes, that's government policy, and that's funding and understanding what working together, not what working disparately means.
Yeah. There's a lot that sits behind this interim report, and for each line of text there are explorations of academic literature, there are explorations of national statistics, there have been no doubt considerations of budgetary implications. It isn't just that, what was it, £17 billion. That's your headline. Whoa, look at this. Because you often see those sorts of numbers thrown around when big change is talked about. What are the savings of doing this? But behind that number, that didn't just get plucked out of the air. That looks at what these impacts that could be reduced are. There are lots more nuanced arguments sitting in documents that none of us will ever see, but that will be passed around Whitehall. And that's what this is for. This isn't about making sure that Mr. Bloggs down the road who's got an 8-year wait to see an adult ADHD service is seen, but not directly. But it will have an impact on that, and hopefully in those 8 years, which it hopefully won't be 8 years for Mr. Bloggs, there will be other supports and other changes in society that will lead to life becoming less challenging. And those are harder won than, okay, here's an ADHD specialist who will diagnose you and give you medication, which I think there has been this sort of perception built up that ADHD care is, because that's all you can get your hands on if you're lucky, is a diagnosis and some medication. And what this document talks about is, no, this is something that is everybody's business, and it's all our faults that this is going on. And just complaining that the NHS have horrible waiting lists, or just complaining that such and such the local authority aren't doing enough, somehow misses the point.
I agree. But I'm not naive enough to think that there will be an element, and a large element, of who do we blame for the fact that we're here? Which party's fault was it? Which politician's fault was it? I think the blame culture is still quite, unfortunately, pervasive, and it gets in the way a lot. But
there are things that people are responsible for. I think it's important to highlight that, yeah, that's true. Don't go just indiscriminately blaming, but there are responsibilities to have done things that have not been done.
Oh, there are. Accountability is different to blame.
Yeah,
I think that's my take on it. But I mean, just scanning the report and looking at the highlights, it talks about a lot of the conversations that you will have had, I know I've had, that we've had together. A lot of the headlines are the ones that we talk about every day. I suppose what I was pleased about is in some ways, it's quite direct. I understand between the lines, reading the context for different people is different, but the bold headlines, I'm just looking at one now. Waiting times for NHS ADHD services have escalated and are unacceptably long. They easily could have phrased that a different way and has come off as dismissive, but it doesn't. He says, yeah, they're too long. Yes, we know that. We're aware they're too long. We know that something needs to change. I think that is heartening. What I was really pleased about, and I picked up on this straight away, I saw the 2 pages of annexes and of research and of reports that shaped the information as well as the lived experience. And I'm really pleased that it's connected research and evidence-based material that we have with the lived experience, and he's sort of layering them on top of each other. That, I think, is really important for other people to realize, because I still see lots of conversations where people don't believe the research, or the research is out of date, or there's no point, and people doing the research don't understand ADHD, which is just nonsense. Yes, research is slower because it takes time, and then it takes time to publish. That doesn't mean it's not coming from a place of understanding, and it doesn't mean there aren't researchers living with ADHD as well. So I was really pleased to see that, and to know that that's shaping the conversations as well, and the fact that that research transcended all the different agencies and all the different challenges that ADHD is impacting as well. I'm wondering what, in the next couple of weeks, the conversation, broadly speaking, will be like, and how people will now digest this, and what they feel will or should happen between now and the final report.
So I think naturally, and I think this is the intention of an interim report, isn't it? People are going to reflect on these clues, if you like, these sort of general directions, and see the shadows that casts across their world. That's what's going to happen. Certainly that's what's happened in my mind, as I've read it, as someone who works in the world of ADHD. And I feel quite pleased that we're on topic, if you like. With the plans that we've got at Divergence very much do align with what seems to be happening, but then that's because we're driven to do what we think is right for folks with ADHD, as is this document. That the big one is that recommendation from hospital to community and what that means, and that is a very powerful series of 4 words. And the recommendations that are aligned to that, very important. And the response that comes from the NHS and the third sector, from local authorities, will be very telling. And we've seen it before. We've seen this language of from hospital to community before, and I think that's why it was chosen. We talk about the Community Care Act was published in 1991, and that was all about from hospital to community, and it's that shift away from very, very specialised support, which is still valid and it's not saying that will go away. They mention it's almost like a passing comment, diabetes, and if you look at the history of the evolution of diabetes services in this country, I think there are some really nice parallels that could give some clues as to how things, hopefully in the hopes of the task force, will evolve, because we saw specialist endocrinologists sitting in hospitals back at the beginning of the process, and now GP surgeries run diabetes clinics. And diabetes is just one example. There are lots of others. So this is a phenomenon that happens in healthcare. But you also see diabetes third sector agencies doing education, and I think if you look at other areas, other social responses to other specialist conditions, I'm seeing the same language here in relation to ADHD, but I'm seeing a really strong rationale for why society should do that and what the savings are and what the benefits are, not just to people with ADHD, but to how society works and thinks about other people in it.
Hi, it's Matt. Sorry to butt in the middle of the episode. I just wanted to have a chat to you about the sponsors for Talk ADHD, which we don't have. In fact, we're never going to be sponsored. So that means that this is a passion project for Andrew and I, and we really rely on your support. So if you can take time to like, comment and subscribe, it really helps this podcast grow organically, and that means it reaches more people, and more people get to hear the information that you know is helping you. So once again, thank you for listening or watching wherever you do, but please do like, comment, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any information about our latest episode. But for now, let's get back to this week's episode. It's interesting as you're saying that, I keep going over this same question. I think it's a really bold, necessary, but a bold and brave move to take to reframe the condition of ADHD from the way it's perceived now to be more aligned to, as you say, taking the model of diabetes or blood pressure or anything else and saying, hold on a minute. I can instantly sense pushback on that. I can instantly sense people, it's not the same thing. Diabetes and ADHD, there's no similarities, but actually there are parallels.
Not in the conditions, no. They're not. No. In the way we respond to it as a society, and with our services and the resources we share with one another. Definitely there are.
The social response is not as in living with the condition, no. But that pushback, I think, has to happen. I think that reticence from, the press or the media or whoever says, they're ridiculous. I think that needs to happen and be heard in order for things to change, in order for people to say, well, the other element to it is this. Now, there's some phrases in that from hospital to community sort of passage. And there's some things that are mentioned that I stopped and reread twice, or several times, in fact. There is a line in there I've never heard, or a term in there I've never heard until last night, about ADHD super specialists and reconsidering whether ADHD assessment and treatment always needs a super specialist. Now, my interpretation of that term is we're talking the likes of you. I would consider you to be what they're talking about, a super specialist, as in the people who have been trained, who are professional, expert, experienced, and therefore, if you see a very complex individual, right, And this is where it gets interesting. If you were to assess and diagnose someone and you went, wait a minute, there are more layers to this person than just do they potentially have ADHD and maybe coexisting autism, there are other mental health. There are my interpretation of super specialists is what they're talking about there. But I wonder whether, if that's the framework they're looking at, and they talk about bringing it into primary care and training more people to conduct, should we say, more assessments of quote unquote more straightforward cases, right? Even those who may not meet the diagnostic criteria, but that then they can support with other frameworks. The one thing that leapt out to me was, I wonder if that's got connections to or anything to do with the ongoing debates about and issues we're seeing with things like right to choose, with shared care. And I wonder if that works, if that's the model they go down, does it potentially have a positive impact on those things? Does it mean the waiting lists slowly but surely come down, and that people that need that very detailed care from a super specialist can access that more easily?
Inevitably, yeah. This is something I've been saying since I understood what those four letters joined together meant, and the early days of the implementation of adult ADHD services. It was almost, well, no, it was blatantly obvious that if you set up a very specialised service for a relatively significant proportion of the population and resource it in a very limited way, but don't allow them to move on once the work is stabilised, that eventually it becomes absolutely stifled. And that's what happened. You know, it was one of the frustrations that led to me exiting the NHS, was it was almost like they didn't want to hear that. So yes, this situation I think was predictable, and in part is created by the restrictions that are put around access to support, but some of those restrictions make sense, and I think that's the difficult debate that I don't think it's in any way over. We are still talking about prescribing controlled drugs. That issue alone is hugely politically weighted. And we could sort of bang on desks and say, but we've got lots of experience with these and it's safe, and you know, if you want a stimulant, there's easier ways to get it than to go through the process of getting diagnosed with ADHD. I think by the time that I've been an ADHD specialist, that rational response I don't think it's won out, but it's gained more traction than the argument that, oh, everybody's just going to want to get diagnosed with ADHD so they can get free speed. Because I don't think I'm yet to meet anyone in years of doing this where I've felt that was the case.
No, neither have I. So then when we talk about the task force talking about medication, again, it's quite pragmatic language in there. It says, yes, the evidence still says that medication is the most effective treatment for those. Now, it's interesting, the nuance here is, I think they refer to it as those very severe cases. And that's a little bit of a, just sort of slid in, right? To say, again, there may be people who aren't going to meet the current criteria, who don't need medication, but then what they need is education. They need information about what else. Yes. So just to step away from the report for a minute, what it does touch upon is the conversation of ADHD and what it means to live with and to experience, or to think you have. That starts way before anyone books an assessment. That starts way before anyone, if they're fortunate enough, gets a diagnosis. And yet something you and I have said for the longest time is, what have they got at the start of the process? Where did they go? Where is the really good, credible, useful information to support them? Where are the communities and the networks? Now, obviously, that's something you and I are very passionate about doing. It's why we've got our WhatsApp community. But just on that, the report is definitely saying the same thing here. It's saying there is a gap. In fact, there are multiple gaps. But one of the big gaps here is education before. What is your personal view of maybe what's missing and why is it still missing?
Okay, there is a huge gap there, and there's lots of thinking going on in there about that, because this isn't just about people who think they've got ADHD and are on a waiting list. This is not what they're saying, and I think a cynic could read through the interim report and say this is just about giving some people some toys to play with in the waiting room, metaphorically speaking. Yeah, but I think there's a bigger piece of work going on here, which is about the social social perceptions of it. But I think this can actually have an impact on the efficiencies of specialist ADHD services as well. Which might be a contentious thing to say, but there are a lot of people who pass through an ADHD service, try medication, say, oh, they don't work for me, and come out the other side. And the more I work in ADHD, the more I think there's some work to be done in research, in understanding what predicts those people who don't make it through to an optimal treatment that works. Those people who, for them, it's not life-changing to get a diagnosis and medication, because all the evidence and all the science suggests it should be. There's a bit in there, I think it's in the second part of the interim report, that talks about children being more responsive to medications than adults. And when I read that, I thought, this is about them being adults. This isn't about the biology. This is about all the other stuff that interfaces with ADHD. I know that's work that you're working on and stuff we've talked about a lot. The impact of life with undiagnosed and even unrecognised ADHD, unsuspected ADHD. Just thinking you're lazy. Just thinking that you're a bit crap. Those sorts of things. And I think that there's a lot to be done before getting to the point of, we need to make a diagnosis of ADHD. We need to understand, and this is certainly how the model that I built, which is different in how we diagnose ADHD at Divergence, is looking, we don't like people to come and say, will you assess me for ADHD? Because we won't. We start with looking at that wider picture. Who are you? What's going on? And that is something that doesn't have to be done by an ADHD specialist. It's something that mental health nurses have been doing since there's been mental health nurses. And I think this has been about the super specialism of ADHD. It was necessary in order to get to this point. But now that we're at this point, it needs to not be so damn special, because it isn't actually that complex. There are more complicated psychiatric conditions. In psychiatry, there are more complex things to deal with and more risky drugs to be prescribed that are prescribed a lot more freely. This is about a society struggling with a new thing, and a new thing that has all sorts of loaded connotations because it's treated with controlled drugs, and it's something that used to just be thought of as something that happened to children, and all of a sudden, because thinking has evolved and science has evolved, all of a sudden we're saying, those people that just crash in a heap after work every day because they're absolutely exhausted from putting on the show again. Maybe there's more to it, and how do we help with that? And that isn't all about prescribing stimulant drugs.
No, and I think the language again that they're using is about it should be needs-based, individual needs-based. Right, and again, there's some terms in the report that I suppose some people have been using or suggesting for a while. So they're defining the difference between an ADHD clinical diagnosis, someone who meets that criteria, then suspected ADHD, but then possible ADHD. Right, there's a step away from that. Okay, but then there's the other one, and this is interesting because I've for a long time gone, what's this? So they're now referring to the ADHD spectrum, and they're using the model again of blood pressure, like you mentioned, as a way of trying to contextualize that. But again, then the last term they're using goes back to this neurodivergence. So is it actually that some of the features that people are thinking this is all ADHD are more of a group of presentations that could fall under many different neurodivergent conditions, but we're not now talking about impairment first. We're talking about what do you need in order to make sense of those, in order to be able to live more happily, freely, successfully, to avoid loss of employment, breakdown of relationship, getting through education, not ended up in criminal justice, right? Now, that's an interesting framework for me. I see the validity of it. My only concern with that is that I can see other people going, well, see, I told you everyone thinks they've got ADHD, and now we're just letting them get away with saying, well, I'm possible ADHD, but you still have to provide me with accommodations and you still have to do for me, right? Which worries me as somebody that does a workplace education on reasonable adjustments. What worries me is that now going to complicate things even more? Just suddenly we start drawing lines where we don't need to draw lines. Does that make sense?
Clinical diagnosis of ADHD says you meet the criteria, and somewhere between 3 and 5% of the population meet those criteria. What this is saying is that there are people with suspected and possible ADHD on waiting lists who aren't going to meet that criteria. My fear is that somehow those suspected and possible cases of ADHD get conflated into the 3 to 5% of the population. That is what, that idea of an ADHD spectrum leans towards that. And my concern is that those sub-threshold possible and suspected ADHD cases, they are not people who are in that 3 to 5% of the population, so they are not necessarily the ones clogging the waiting lists up. And it's a bit of a deflection from saying, we don't have the capacity to deal with the volumes of people who do meet the criteria sitting on waiting lists. And I'm not saying everybody on a waiting list does, but a lot of them do, and they can't get a service, not because there are lots of people with suspected and possible but definitely not clinical presentations of ADHD. They're not getting a service because there isn't the capacity to deliver that. But there just isn't. We can't all of a sudden, if you invented a new condition today and said, right, we need to deal with 5% of the population have now got this new thing, and we can just, with a 3-hour assessment, we can titrate them onto a medication, and it really, really helps and makes massive differences. It's going to take 20 years to see any kind of impact on that new condition. And this is the position along the road that we're on. We're just a bit further down the road than this new condition that I'm hypothetically talking about today. Yeah. And I think ideas like suspected and possible ADHD and the ADHD spectrum are about sort of dressing up the definition of who fits into what criteria. So I didn't like that bit.
But it's going to get attention, isn't it?
It is going to get attention. I am concerned that it dilutes the idea just as much as those, it's only the most severe cases of ADHD that need medication. Well, that's not what the research says. What the research says is, if you're diagnosed with ADHD, the most effective thing to do is give you a medication. Now, that's not in there. Don't look over there, because we can't deliver that. What we can deliver is lots of educational support and helping you think differently about things. Now, they're valid things. Just because medication is the most effective thing to do when someone meets the criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD doesn't mean that that's all sorted. And I think there's a bit of a social perception that that's the case, and it's not. That people can be optimized on medication and still have difficulties that they can, with learning skills, improve on. And yes, it's possible to learn those skills before the medication, and that's the debate here. It is.
Yeah, what's interesting for me, and just to sort of wrap this whole thing up, was there were people at the Congress who were involved with the conversations that the task force have been having, and the Neurodivergence Task and Finish group will be having. And I think what it really sort of hit home for me was nobody invested in this conversation about ADHD is taking this lightly. Nobody's looking for the short way out. Nobody's looking to dismiss the experience of people living with it. In fact, you just used the word that I think is important. The passion with everyone I met from all over the world was the same. These are people in their way doing the best work they can to support others and to advance what we know of this thing called ADHD and its coexisting sort of conditions and challenges. And if there's anything everyone watching this can take from that and from this interim report, and the fact that we even have a task force, is that rather than just trying to sweep ADHD under the carpet and wait for it to die down and wait for it to go away, it is being tackled head on. It is being spoken about. This is about shaping future policy. This is about long-term change. I think we all have to be realistic, Andrew, and say, just because there's a report and a final report that will come out maybe in September, it doesn't mean that by January, everything's better and everything's changed. Obviously, there will still be problems for a long time yet, but at least they're being spoken about, which all we can do is hope leads to the action that's necessary. And look, it's not going to be right first time. Things will be trialed and they will fail. Changes will be put in place. They won't work. They won't suit people. We have to accept that's going to happen, right? I firmly believe that. But the fact that we're talking about it, the fact that it's happening, I think shows that there is intent. There's real positive intent to say it ain't going away. You, me, and everyone else with ADHD are not going away. And therefore, yes, reframing it more as a public health issue than this niche little social media buzzword condition that it seems to have been labelled as can only be positive, right?
Yeah. The task force seem to be saying this is real. This is something that's happening in our society. As you were talking, there was something I really wanted to add, and that is that there are different perspectives on this. This isn't a there is one answer to this. I think in the world of ADHD, there's this expectation that there's going to be the one thing, the one hack, the one way of sorting it all out. And there's not. Here's the harsh news for you guys. There's never just one solution to these sorts of complex problems. And there will be things said that you and I disagree with that are right. There will be things that you and I say that are right, but other people disagree with. That is the nature of divergence.
Yeah.
Not the company.
Yeah.
The concept. People are different and people need different things. And it is the richness is having these perspectives and accepting that someone can have a different perspective and even see things that from your perspective are wrong, but from their perspective are right. And their things that we think are wrong have value in this bigger thing that is a social response to difficulties with focus and concentration, hyperactivity and impulsivity.
No, I completely agree. Well, folks, in which case, go away and read the report. If you haven't, there'll be a link in the notes. It's available online. Do read it. It's important. It might not have been written for you, as you've heard, but it's important that you do read it because inevitably someone's going to ask you about it and it does shape things. Please let us know. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you think of the report. Please do like and share the podcast. We are becoming the podcast that you want, that provides you with a different approach. So add it to all the podcasts you listen to by all means, but please do like it and share it and subscribe wherever you watch or listen. And we will see you almost live and direct from a conference room in Prague for the next episode with even more commentary and insight onto this thing called ADHD. But for now, thank you very much, and we will see you soon.
See you soon.
Thanks again for watching and listening to this week's episode of Talk ADHD. We really do hope it helped. And as you now know, it really helps us if you can like, comment, and subscribe to this channel and podcast. Your help helps this channel continue to grow and helps our information reach more people. And we'll see you again very soon for another episode of Talk ADHD.